a bit more about the partnership, I'm going to talk about how we're investing in the system. We believe in the need to innovate, to advance solutions, and ultimately hold companies and others within the supply chain accountable. And that's one of the ways that we're working to drive change. I will also note and share a little bit that we also are advocating for policy, and we think that ultimately that's going to be an important part of the solution. But of course, for the topic today, we will be focused on these voluntary initiatives to help drive the change that we're looking for. So first of all, we're going to talk about the recycling partnership. Now, hopefully at this point, most of you are familiar with the recycling partnership, but just in case you're not, then I want to provide a little bit of an overview of who we are. So the Recycling Partnership is a national nonprofit focused on transforming recycling to accelerate the U.S. circular economy. Ultimately, we are investing in the system. We raise funds from companies, foundations, and members throughout the entire value chain, and we invest that in action. This action comes in the form of grants to communities to improve their recycling programs. We provide seed funds so that communities can either increase access to recycling, perhaps where there's none, in the form of carts, or perhaps improving their system by, again, increasing access to cards or by education and optimization initiatives. You can see over the last 6 or so years since the partnership has started, we've had tremendous reach. We have reached more than 1,500 communities, reaching 75 million households across the U.S., increasing recycling and ultimately increasing the amount of material that is available for post-consumer recycled content. Of course, we also need to be increasing demand to go along with that, and that's some of what we will talk about today. Now, a couple of other things that are newer for the partnership that we'll talk a bit about is efforts to really think about what's coming into the system as well as what happens to it afterward. So we know that if we don't think about the packaging and working, of course, with APR and others, making sure that that material is designed to go into the system to be recyclable and ultimately to be reused, then the system is not going to be successful. So we have a few newer initiatives that are focused on innovating to advance the system while also improving the design of packaging to be more circular. These are our partners and generous supporters. So we, of course, are very thankful for these many companies and organizations, foundations that help make all of the great work of our nonprofit successful. Here are a few of the things. So the Recycling Partnership, as I've noted, you may know us for really focusing on increasing the access to recycling cards, providing those free educational materials. But you've also probably noticed lately that we're expanding. Again, we're thinking about what do we need to do as an organization and where can we have a positive impact to make sure that the materials coming into the system are designed to be part of a circular economy. We also are thinking about what can we do to reduce the use of materials, ultimately using more recycled content, so really increasing the domestic end markets and improving the domestic end markets and increasing demand so that the system can operate successfully. We are also working together through pre-competitive collaborations to advance the system. So this is in the form of grants that will soon be coming out to improve things like sortation for polypropylene. So this is what we call our strategic framework. It's a high-level overview of some of the areas that we believe need to evolve and that we're actively working to improve to advance the U.S. circular economy. Of course, this is a lot, and a lot of organizations are partnering with us in the space. So a few of the things that we focus on that we're really going to dive a bit deeper on today are community engagement. So this is that core work of the partnership where we're providing grants to scale recycling infrastructure. Again, one of the things that's important is traditionally we've provided grants to improve access to recycling through carts, to provide free toolkits and technical resources to improve systems in the form of education materials, as well as optimization initiatives. And ultimately, this is increasing the capture of recyclables from homes so we can get more of that supply into the system. Another piece that we're focused on is expediting the transition to circular packaging. So we know that, again, we have to think about what's coming into that cart, what's leaving the homes, where does it go, how can we make sure that it is part of the system and that it is able to be captured and recycled into other materials. We have an initiative on this called the Pathway to Circularity that we'll be diving a little bit deeper on. And ultimately, we're also intervening and supporting solutions to innovate the system and improve sortation, as well as the use of materials. At the end of the day, though, we know that these voluntary initiatives are important, but we have to hold people accountable through a transparent way. And that's one of the reasons that we're really excited to be part of the US Plastics Pact and believe so strongly in the power and ability for that to help increase accountability of companies and producers and others within the system. And ultimately, we are looking to policy to help catalyze that shift as well. So what is the Pathway to Circularity? So this is a relatively new initiative that was launched by the Recycling Partnership, and it is thinking comprehensively. So we know that as we look at packaging entering the system, sometimes there's confusion about what is okay and what isn't. Of course, APR has done a fantastic job on the design guides, but sometimes companies don't even know that design guides exist. How can we as the partnership help point more and more people to those resources and make sure that they're using them? How can we work together to solve some of the challenges that are currently not being addressed? There's even some places where there's still questions. Maybe it's not clear. So it's widely known that access to recycling needs to be at least 60% in order for something to be considered recyclable. But there are some other questions that are outstanding, like packaging prevalence. What percentage of a package within the industry needs to be the same before a community or a MRF is comfortable accepting it? These are some of the things that the Pathway to Circularity is looking at with the assistance of what we call the Circularity Council. So the Circularity Council is bringing together about 35 leaders from the industry, and together we're tackling some of these tough questions. We know that we have to make it very clear for companies and packaging producers who want to be part of the solution. We have to help them understand and make it very easy for them to follow the guidelines so they can be part of the system. And sometimes that means addressing this gray space and making it really clear what they need to do. So that is really what the Pathway to Circularity is focused on at a high level. One of the things that we also recognize, though, as we get into some of these materials or package types, sometimes there are challenges that are still preventing that material from being captured at the rate that we are all looking for. And that is where we recommend pre-competitive collaborations. I'll give you a couple of examples of those. So one is, you may have recently seen the Recycling Partnership working with a number of our supporters to launch the Polypropylene Recycling Coalition. As we look at polypropylene, we know that it's a very important material. It has unique properties. It has the ability to be sorted, but not all facilities are able to sort it at this point in time. So what can we do by working together pre-competitively with users of polypropylene to increase the capture of the material and ultimately increase the access? Using the model that the Recycling Partnership has proven over the years, we are now offering grants to facilities to increase access to sortation of polypropylene. And ultimately, the goal will be to support access to polypropylene recycling throughout the United States. We know that there is demand for this material. That is something we need to continue to work with our partners and others on. And that's something this coalition is actively working on, as well as improving the sustainable demand of recycled polypropylene. And that will be coupled with these grants to help MRFs and facilities invest in that infrastructure that's needed, the equipment that's needed, as well as education to increase the recycling of polypropylene. Over time, you can see that through this initiative, we aim to regain the widely recyclable status of polypropylene, ultimately increasing the access for Americans across the country, and then increasing the recycling rate of the material as well. This is just one example of a coalition that the Recycling Partnership has. We have similar coalitions for things like film and flexible materials. So through the pathway to circularity, anytime we see an opportunity where there is, again, a material or a package type that needs specific interventions, then we're encouraging companies to come together either with the Recycling Partnership or with some of the other action agents in the space, so that we can all work together to solve these challenges, because we know ultimately that's what it's going to take. As we discussed though, this voluntary action is very important, and we have to hold companies accountable. We have to recognize those who are leading the way, and we need to encourage more companies to be part of the solution and to report transparently on their progress, so that together we can all increase the demand for these materials. We can work together to create the system change that is needed to improve recycling and ultimately the circular economy. So that's why we're really pleased earlier, just a couple of months ago, to partner with Ellen MacArthur Foundation and World Wildlife Fund to launch the U.S. Plastics Pact. The U.S. Plastics Pact is bringing together government, business, and nonprofit organizations to set a national strategy. So we believe that we need clear targets and a clear roadmap on how to reach those. And that's what the team that is leading the pact is working on. Also, as part of this, we are requiring that companies measure and report their progress through a consistent and transparent way. That is going to be one of the keys to success, as we are seeing more and more companies make commitments in this space, which is fantastic and is so important to create that demand signal. And we also need to make sure that they're delivering on it. And that transparent reporting is a really important factor to do that. And the U.S. Plastics Pact is one of the key initiatives that will be accelerating that progress. The U.S. Plastics Pact is joining a network of pacts from around the world. You can see, and actually I'm noticing, I think this map has already been added onto some more as we continue to see more pacts launched. And ultimately, this is about really localizing the solutions and making sure that from the U.S., we are pursuing those solutions that will work best for us. The U.S. Plastics Pact has set 4 targets that are in line with those global targets, but again, will be customized for the U.S. The approach and the roadmap to reach these will be. You can see the 4 targets there, which are focused on defining a list of packaging that's problematic or unnecessary by 2021, and then taking measures to eliminate them. Focused on 100% of plastic packaging that will be reusable, recyclable, or compostable by 2025. And then undertaking ambitious actions to effectively recycle or compost 50% of plastic packaging by 2025, and using an average of 35% recycled content or responsibly sourced bio-based content by 2025. Now, no doubt, we all know and recognize these are extremely ambitious targets. And we also believe that big change is needed in order to address the challenge that we are all facing. And by working together through the U.S. Plastics Pact and through other initiatives, that is how we believe that we will be most successful. We do commend the many companies and organizations. We have more than 60 now that have committed to this transparent reporting and to being part of this national solution through the U.S. Plastics Pact. This is something that is regularly growing, and we would encourage any organization who wants to be part of the solution, from governments to nonprofit to companies, to join the U.S. Plastics Pact. But as I hinted to in the beginning, ultimately, we think that these voluntary initiatives are critical. And it is so important that we innovate these solutions, that we prove them now, that we invest to make this transition. And it's probably going to take more than that. That's why we do have an arm of our organization focused on advocating and accelerating policy. We call it our Circular Economy Policy Accelerator, and it's focused on building consensus and advocating for policy that is attainable and legislative solutions that will ultimately advance the circular economy. A few of the key points and key focus areas of this approach is on incentivizing recycling over disposal, securing sustainable funding for this recycling infrastructure and education, and expediting those innovative public-private solutions. So in short, I'll share again, just to kind of recap some of those key points. We at the Recycling Partnership are focused on raising funds to invest in the system, to scale recycling infrastructure, advance innovation, and to hold companies accountable. And in the long run, we also think that we need transformative policy to help accelerate progress to these solutions and make sure that everyone is helping to lead the way to a circular economy. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Lynn, and
Great.
Happy to answer questions now, or I think maybe we're going to wait until the end.
Yeah, let's wait to the end. You do have several coming in. So first of all, thank you. Fabulous and very impressive work. Pete, while I make a remark, I'm making you the presenter. I just want to remind people to use the question box. We do have several great questions coming in, but I'm not going to ask them until we get further along. And so with that, Pete, thank you so very, very much. We can see your screen, and looking forward to it. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, Lynn. I'm just getting set up here. Just 1 second. Perfect. Great. Well, thanks, Lynn. It's good to be with everybody. It's a pleasure to be with Sarah and Steve, who, the folks at Nestle Waters. We have so much respect and appreciation for the work that you all do. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here together. As Lynn mentioned, my name is Pete DePasquale. I lead government affairs for Nestle Waters North America. In that capacity, I represent the organization on our advocacy, both at the state and the federal level. At last October's NERC annual meeting in Providence, Adam from SPC said that we were in an era of corporate commitments. That comment really did stick with me, and I count it as a privilege to represent an organization of action. And as a result, we've kind of named today's presentation to you all the action behind the commitments and how we're really trying to work to stimulate supply and demand for post-consumer recycled content. Much of what I talk about today is going to be how we view this topic, our packaging roadmap. But like Sarah, we also see that public policy ultimately is going to play a critical role. So at the end of the conversation, we'll share some thoughts with the group on public policy solutions that we've been very outspoken and active on. As Lynn said, Nestle Waters is one of the nation's leading healthy hydration companies. We produce a bottled water portfolio that includes 3 premium imported brands, Perrier, San Pellegrino, and Aqua Panna, as well as a portfolio of domestic products. that are regional spring waters. These are spring waters that are sourced from spring waters across the country and then distributed geographically. So those of us who are in the Northeast, many of us consume Poland Spring. In the Mid-Atlantic, it's Deer Park. Down in Florida, it's Zephyr Hills. Midwest is Ice Mountain. Down in Texas, Oklahoma is Ozarka. And then, of course, west of the Rockies is Arrowhead. We also sell Nestle Pure Life, which is a purified water company. So for the next few minutes, I want to walk you through the activities we're focused on to promote the supply and use of recycled content and to make circularity real and sustainable. While our products are delivered in a variety of formats, including reusable, the majority of our products are packaged in PET, resin code number 1. And before I discuss recycled content specifically, I want to just walk us through how we view packaging stewardship and our packaging roadmap. Our roadmap is really grounded in a vision where packaging is made from recycled, reusable, renewable materials, is treated as a valuable raw material. And as we move as an organization and as a society from a paradigm of waste management to one of resource recovery, the result will be, of course, less waste and less leakage. And so as an organization, we've identified 5 areas that are really the pillars for us as we think about this topic. The first is designing our products for recycling, designed for recyclability. We see this really as table stakes, kind of the ground floor of product stewardship. Working with folks like APR, and I know Steve will probably talk a little bit about this, but also working with MRF operators. We're trying to have a better understanding at the design stage of our products and have an idea of how all different kind of design attributes of our product, will interact with the supply chain. From color, adhesives, caps, designs, label designs, our goal is to create products that are universally recyclable, that do not contribute to any sort of contamination. Second, of course, is inspiring consumers to recycle, and we've had a great working relationship with TRP on this. Part of this is really helping our consumers to understand their role in the circular economy and create a shared responsibility for collection. For us, that's included becoming the first beverage company to adopt the How to Recycle label, as well as initiatives like our partnership with TRP to run the #NotTrash campaign that uses QR codes on our packaging and social media to create a recycling hotline to answer consumer questions about recycling. That's been a very successful campaign, something that we're really proud of. Third, of course, is supporting recycling infrastructure. TRP, as well as the Closed Loop Fund, have been great partners for us to help us understand the needs of the system, as well as to target investment dollars in a very strategic way. The fourth area, and this is where I'll be spending the majority of our time today, is the work that we're doing to support the development of a robust end market for post-consumer content. Fifth, of course, is reimagining our product ultimately, kind of the material innovation aspects, really trying to figure out what the next iteration of packaging needs to be. Last week, many of you might have saw that Poland Spring, we announced a partnership with the University of Maine to begin diving deeper into exploring how second generation cellulosic materials could be used as a bio-based material for Poland Spring's packaging. Those are exciting work streams, of course, further down the line, but wonderful to be a part of. I'm gonna skip through these just so we remain on time here. We've been at the forefront in the beverage industry in our use of recycled content in our packaging. We began in 2011 beginning to blend rPET in some of our packaging, mostly in California. In 2016, we were able to begin producing all of our Arrowhead and Nestle Pure Life half-liter bottles in California with 50% recycled content. We couldn't have done that work without strategic partners like Carbon Light. As many of you are aware, California law requires annual reporting for beverage manufacturers to report their use of PCR in beverage containers. This year, we reported a use of 37% across our entire portfolio sold in California. This is a major achievement for us. In 2018, we began expanding our use of recycled content to other regional spring water brands and announced a goal of reaching 25% recycled content in our portfolio in 2021 and 50% by 2025. We're working to, as we said, of course, to reimagine the bottle as well, working to create more sustainable packaging through the use of recycled content, supporting emergent technologies like bio-based materials, thinking beyond the bottle, leveraging our home and office delivery services, as well as hydration station formats to promote the use of reusable bottles as well. When we look back at our commitments and what we've accomplished, we're really proud of it. This year, we launched 12 new bottles made from 100% recycled and 100% recyclable material. Our Poland Spring brand is really the forefront where we have a commitment to transfer that entire portfolio to 100% recycled plastic by 2022. Our work has been recognized by ISRI, and we've also received a lot of positive attention for some of our new innovative floatable label technologies that can have sleeve wraps, but still can effectively work with the recycling stream and not act as a contaminant. But as I said in the beginning, continuing to achieve these commitments is going to take changes in public policy. The two areas that we are most focused on, I'm going to talk about the second one first, and that's supporting ambitious and attainable post-consumer recycled content standards to stimulate and stabilize supply and demand. One of the things that we've recognized since being a large purchaser of recycled content since the early 2010s, 2011, was that many of the commitments that big brands were making would ebb and flow with the cost of virgin material. And when we didn't see that there's parity with the higher cost of recycled content, you'd see brands exiting the use of recycled content. As a result, many brands were not executing long-term supply contracts with recycled content reclaimers. Without those long-term supply contracts, reclaimers aren't really able to make the investments in collection capacity reclaiming that they need to make. So one of the things that we've committed to as an organization is executing those long-term supply contracts for post-consumer recycled content. That allows our reclaimer partners to go to capital markets, raise the funds that they need, and to continue to capitalize their own businesses. We believe that recycled content standards, like the one that was recently passed in California, AB 793, are absolutely critical as a demand-side intervention to create stable demand for post-consumer recycled content. In many ways, we see this similar to what happened in the renewable energy space, a decade ago with renewable portfolio standards. In some ways, it operates in the same way. So, we continue as an organization to really want to bring, reasonable but also progressive recycled content standards and proposing them, particularly in the places of the country where reclaiming capacity already exists. The second policy intervention is increased work to modernize and to make more uniform systems regarding deposit returns, particularly in the Northeast. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, our Poland Spring brand has a commitment to reach 100% recycled content by 2021. In order to meet that and to keep it to be sustainable, we need a collection system that is delivering that raw material back to us. We want those bottles back. And as a result, a lot of our focus, particularly in this coming year, will be to catalyze a conversation in the Northeast regarding what modernization and even regional uniformity could look like in the region's bottle deposit bills. Well, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone. And I think in most, part of me moving quickly through this presentation is that I often find that your questions are much more interesting than the content. So looking forward to, once Steve presents, revisiting some of these issues with you and answering your questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Pete. That was fabulous. And you are correct. There are many, many questions. But again, we're going to keep you in suspense. And thank you for that excellent work that you're doing and presentation. And Steve, I am making you the presenter. And so you will need to unmute yourself, Steve. And let's see. So Steve, you need to show your screen. So Steve, we can't hear you if you're talking. If you want me to show your slideshow, I can, but I need a cue that is what you would like. So let's see. Oh, there he goes. Okay, so now we need hi, Steve.
Okay.
Can you show your screen, or do you want me to do that?
Why don't you just show my screen and I'll run it, okay?
That is fine. Let's see if I can show somebody. You know what? I can't show somebody else's screen. You need to show your screen, or I can show the webinar and you tell me the presentation and you tell me when to advance it. Looks like you've solved the entire issue. Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve, and look forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I never like following two great presentations because it's tough enough to speak, and then you hear these great presentations. So, but certainly hope that that we can make this work, and we will go from there. So, the conversation today is supposed to be about driving voluntary initiatives for minimum content. And, at APR, look, we're the plastic recyclers, right? So, we have in order for anybody to meet their minimum content requirements, it's dependent upon the recyclers to be able to get enough supply in order to process the material to make it available. And there are a couple of things there, though, that are involved with that. So it's not just simply saying, yes, okay, we want some more recycled content. It's really a system-wide approach that we have to deal with. So first of all, who we are, we are the trade association, obviously, of the recyclers, and we work with folks that obviously are committed to growing and sustaining this industry. And our primary goals obviously are to increase supply and really enhance the quality, because reducing contamination has a major impact on the marketplace and our ability to supply the material that brands say they want in order to use the content. And obviously we need to expand that demand, which is what we're going to be chatting about today. And it's incumbent upon us to communicate that value as we proceed through the marketplace. So I'm going to talk about several programs that we have that really impact, ultimately, at the end, the quality of the supply of material that's available to meet these sustainability goals. We talk about circularity, we talk about sustainability. You can't have circularity without recycling. It's got to be as a core component of what you're doing relative to recycling. And in order to do that, APR has a number of programs that, first of all, our design guide, which works with brand owners to train their packaging engineers on how to deal with the innovations that they're developing in the marketplace and to make sure they're compatible with recycling. We do customized training, and we have a number of programs which I'll be addressing a little bit further on with our demand champions and our PCR certification, along with our advocacy and legislative activity. So the design for recyclability, the APR design guide, is probably the world's foremost authority on how a consumer brand company can design their packaging so it's compatible with the recycling infrastructure. You know, we don't necessarily believe that anybody designs a package that it ultimately, you know, is not going to be compatible with recycling or wants to contaminate the stream. But, you know, those of us who are in this business, you know, there's a lot of things we take for granted. And as we get more and more into these very large global brands, it's sometimes shocking sometimes to realize that even though, you know, you're designing a new package, the recyclability of that innovation in that package or the new package itself sometimes isn't in the forefront of the mindset of what we're going, of what the engineer, the packaging engineer is working toward. And so, you know, our goal is to work with brand companies to ensure that their packaging engineers understand the implications of any design on the recyclability of that package. And we've had tremendous success with this over the last 4 years, working with training a lot of brands. And as a result, we're seeing less contamination in the marketplace. It's first to understand, I think, what is meant when APR says something is recyclable, right? Because at the end of the day, in order for us to be able to access enough material so that we can process that material, you know, recyclers can only process the material that's made available to them by the system in order to process and create recycling. And then if you look at what we consider to be recyclable, there are multiple components. Sarah talked about access, but it's important to remember that 60% consumer access is not the only criteria for whether or not the FTC or the legal community will determine whether or not something is recyclable. It's got to be collected or in the market as defined by the legal system. And then so it has to be processed by the existing infrastructure. Can it be collected? Can it be sorted properly? If it can't be sorted, doesn't matter what you call it, what you make it, it's not recyclable. And then at the end of the day, can it be manufactured into a second product? And is there a demand market for that material? So APR has, according to our testing protocols and our design guide, obviously we have, you know, when we do these tests with brand companies and converters, APR preferred, APR, you know, yellow, yeah, it's recyclable, but we got to do a whole lot with it. And then, of course, it's not recyclable because the entire package simply is contaminating the stream. So when we talk about the stream, when we talk about how material walks its way through the stream, if you think linearly, okay, when the consumer puts something into the bin, and then the bin is picked up, and then it's taken to the MRF or by the hauler, and then it's separated out into a bale, and then it goes to a plastic processor. Up until that point, what we've been doing is collecting, sorting, and processing trash. The entire monetization for the system is based upon market demand, the demand component. So what we're talking about today is not just how we can, you know, help voluntary initiatives for making recycled content available, but at the end of the day, market demand ultimately not just monetizes the system, but it also creates the incentive for the system to ultimately produce that sort of recycled content. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Very simply, to close the loop on packaging, it's got to be collected and it's got to be recycled into new products. Again, circularity is a term everybody loves these days, but what does that mean? Well, that means that for a product to be circular or to have circularity, it must not just be collected. It must, first of all, be designed appropriately. then it must be collected, then it must walk through the system, it must be processed, and it must, at the end of the day, have a market. Now, the initial step there is extremely important, because if a product is not designed with recyclability in mind, what you end up with is you end up contaminating the very stream upon which you want the recycler to develop recyclate for you to utilize. You know, in graduate school, we had a software term called garbage in, garbage out. And so, you know, you need to ensure that the product is designed appropriately in order for it then to be able to go through the system and to generate recycled content somewhere down the line. And, you know, by doing all that, you're creating a more robust system, and you're making the system, you're allowing the system to work the way it should work, in that you then can create throughout the system that recyclate that brands are saying that they need to meet their sustainability commitments. This is what you don't want. At the end of the day, you don't want to have a mandatory regulatory requirement ultimately to drive mandated recycled content. You would hope that we'd be able to achieve this without regulatory guidelines. But if in fact we do not continue to create the demand that we need on a voluntary basis, this is what we're going to face. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to work together to create that market demand on a voluntary basis. Otherwise, this is what we're going to be facing. So at APR, you know, we do work in a very broad base, and we do have our design guide has formed some of the basis, if you will, for the Walmart Sustainability Playbook, where we work very closely with Walmart. The New Plastics Economy and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, their definition of recyclability and recycling is primarily based on APRs, and the APR worked with them along the way to help do that. We are an early supporter of the plastic pack and very much engaged in that. So, you know, we're sort of in the middle of everything that's going on out there, because at the end of the day, you know, in order for, we're sort of the transactional piece between a brand saying they want to meet their commitments, and we're the transactional piece to help them and support them in making those commitments. Because if you can't recycle the material, or if there's not recyclate available, they're not going to be able to meet those commitments. Some of the ways that we work from a voluntary basis to support this is we have the Demand Champions program. It's when we publicize those companies that have committed to use additional recycled material on a year-to-year basis. And this is just one snapshot of halfway through 2019. You can see some of the companies there. But what's important about this is that this program has changed the paradigm upon which people talk about using recycled material. Because historically, we were talking about products such as plastic pallets and slip sheets and dunnage crates, but the universe has come to us and said, well, how about if we use it in this application, or how about if we use it in you know, these other applications? And so there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm going, and we've already seen we're way beyond this number already for 2020, and more coming on a day-to-day basis. The other thing that APR does is APR has the first ever PCR certification program. This program certifies that the resin that a brand owner is purchasing comes from post-consumer material. So if Peter at Nestle wants to use recycled material, he should be looking at a recycler who is selling certified post-consumer material in the marketplace. Because let's be honest, when you tell a consumer your container has recycled content in it, what they assume is that that content comes from the material that they use and they put in their recycling bin. They're not thinking this is plant scrap or Millbrook or anything like that. They're thinking it's the material that has been through the system that they've participated in ultimately to generate recycled content. And APR has that certification program that is up and running, and there's more to come on that in a couple of months. And this is how the certification program works. We have third-party auditors, and those auditors work with reclaimers to conduct an audit and a certification, and then we promote and we certify the PCR from the members. So happy to talk more about that. One of the things I wanted to just address in closing, because I want to save some time for questions, Peter talked about the cost. He talked about the cost of recycled resin versus virgin resin. You know, at APR, we think that's the wrong metric, because if you're a brand company and you've made sustainability commitments to your consumer, when you use recycled content in your container, that is an additionality to that container. That's like a new label that helps you sell more, that helps the consumer come to that more. That's a communication vehicle to the consumer that they have asked for your company to make a sustainability commitment. And then they see those commitments, and that container with recycled content is the communication vehicle to the consumer that you've asked for us to be sustainable. Yes, we are sustainable. So it's a communication vehicle. We don't just look at recycled content as a cost. We look at it as a communication and an enhancement of the consumer brand. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think that there's a lot of activity out there that focuses on this. But let me say this, for all the programs that are out there, for everything that everybody's talking about, okay, in terms of infrastructure development and legislative activities, whatever, if market demand were to expand on a voluntary basis, we would be able to monetize the system so that the entire system would be able to expand and create the infrastructure on its own that ultimately will solve the problem of plastics packaging in the recyclability space, in the sustainability space. So at the end of the day, either voluntary or mandated market demand / recycled content, in our opinion, is the key driver to ultimately solving the plastics packaging sustainability issue. And with that, Lynn, I will shut my yap and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was tremendous. And there's still time for people to put in additional questions. I'm going to ask all the speakers to turn their cameras on, please. And I'm going to hopefully succeed with something, which would be a bummer if I don't, but we'll find out. That's great. So I'm going to ask you, Steve, if you could just clarify something as a starting point, because we had several questions that came in related to this, and then we'll get into some of the juicy things. So all three of you have used the term recycled content, and I'm going to say you've used it loosely. When you are referring, it could be Steve, it could be any of you could respond to this. When you use the term recycled content, are you using that as a shorthand for post-consumer recycled content? Or as Steve was discussing some of the challenges about public perception, are you in fact referring to any source of recycled content? So Steve, if you wouldn't mind going first, and then if Sarah and Pete have anything they want to add before I start asking you the toughies, I would appreciate it.
Well, we're adamant that when we talk about recycled content, it's post-consumer content, because frankly, we think anything else is misleading to the public. And so, you know, the general public, when they see something made of recycled content, as I indicated earlier, they believe in their mind that the content came from a container that they handled and they put in the system. We don't believe that post-industrial, pre-consumer, or anything like that means recycled content. So when we talk recycled content, we mean post-consumer.
Thank you. And Pete, do you have a similar perspective?
Yeah, you know, our perspective is the same as Steve. When we talk about recycled content, we're talking about PCR. We're talking about bottles being made back into bottles through a mechanical recycling infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah, you are currently muted, but you have any, oh, there she comes. Do you have anything you would like to add to that?
I completely support what Steve and Pete both said. If there is any other type of recycled content, industrial content use, that just needs to be differentiated. So of course, we know that that's an important part of the solution, but the focus today needs to be on PCR.
Great. Well, okay, you all agreed with each other, so that wasn't very exciting. But let's ask a different question. So there have been several questions that have come in, different perspectives on related topics, laws. So Pete, you certainly brought up container deposit laws earlier. One of our audience members noted that usually brands oppose these things, but Nestle is kind of an outlier on this. And then Steve, you implied that you don't support, you meaning APR, don't support minimum recycled content legislative or regulatory activity. And Sarah, I'm not sure where TPR falls on this. So let's start with Sarah, since I don't know what she's going to say. What do you think about regulatory action versus voluntary action in this sphere?
I believe that they're both an important part of the solution. At the end of the day, what we need is comprehensive legislation. So when we think about legislation that is going to make an impact, we need sustainable funding. So for example, we recently put out a policy research piece that is advocating for a packaging and printed paper fee that would fund the infrastructure as well as the education that the system needs. Another important aspect of that from our perspective is that it would be eco-modulated. So think that that fee will be discounted for packages that are designed to be recyclable and can contribute to being a valuable part of the system, as well as rewarding those companies that are using recycled content. So when we think about the eco-modulation, we see this type of comprehensive legislation as being the best solution to get the funding that's needed, while also rewarding those companies that are being part of the solution. So that's a specific example of a policy mechanism that we are supportive of. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we are willing to review and to consider a variety of legislative or regulatory mechanisms. It would depend on a case-by-case basis, but ultimately, as long as it's generating sustainable funding and helping support the overall system, that's what we at the Recycling Partnership are looking for.
Thanks. And Steve, what would you say?
Let me be very clear. APR was the first organization to support mandated recycled content 15 years ago. We've supported it every year since. We believe that mandated recycled content is the true solution, straightforward, to the point, less confusing than anything else, that will ultimately save the market, the recycling marketplace. So if I somehow said what you don't want somewhere down the line, I was talking about probably brands, not APR. Policy must be a driver. We supported California. We're going to continue to support recycled content.
Thank you. And Pete, how would you contribute to this?
Well, great. I mean, I think I was, pretty clear, and I think Nestle Waters has been pretty clear. I think unfortunately we find ourselves as an outlier on the deposit return system conversation. I think part of it is we've been at the PCR procurement game for a lot longer than a lot of other brands. And as we move forward procuring more PCR, we recognize that deposit return systems play an important role to get our bottles back. Now, I think we can certainly critique some of the programs in the United States as underperforming, but when we look at that system, and if we truly want to make bottles out of bottles, we see them, particularly in the Northeast, where we're so focused right now on increasing, the Poland Spring content, that they're essential. And so for us, I think they need to evolve to be a consistent scope of products. They shouldn't discriminate based upon the liquid that's inside the product. There should be a meaningful deposit. There should be minimum performance standards on redemption, handling fees, should actually represent the true cost to handle the commodity, and the consumer experience needs to be better. And so, you know, we've been trying to catalyze that conversation, you know, probably for the last, you know, year and a half, being very outspoken about it, and we're going to continue to be very outspoken about it. You know, and I think it's unfortunate if the rest of the industry isn't quite there yet, but I believe as they continue to increase the amount of PCR in their own products, I think they're going to find themselves in the same situation. You know, we don't, you know, we want our bottles back, right? And so when you start with what your result needs to be, it's a lot easier to think through policy versus coming at it maybe with an ideological bent, or, you know, or some other way.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to use these comments as an opportunity to promote an upcoming webinar, which will take a moment. So on October 28th, NERC is hosting a webinar about best management practices, modifications, proposals for enhancing bottle bills, container deposit laws. So put that out there. So, you know, all of you have spoken potently about the role that regulatory action can take. So of course, this webinar's theme is voluntary action. So I would like your insights about how those leverage each other. So Sarah, why don't you start, please?
Sure. So one of the key things that we see as an opportunity through the voluntary initiatives right now is to prove the solution. We know that when we are successful at getting the funding and getting the legislation passed, we have to have already proven what those solutions are, so then that funding can be invested in it. That's why you see us really leaning in on some of these pre-competitive collaborations to prove the solution for polypropylene, prove what's going to work for film and flexibles, for example. So then as we are successful at getting the policy passed, we'll know exactly where those funds need to be injected. So as I think about it from a partnership perspective, I think oftentimes we're innovating through some of the work that we do through our new ventures, and then we're scaling through our traditional model of engaging in providing grants for communities, for example. But ultimately, to accelerate that progress, that's where policy is going to come in.
And Steve?
Well, you know, some of us have been at this for quite a while. And, you know, there have been, we view regulation as a sort of a baseline to sort of prime, to generate activity in the marketplace. It doesn't have to be the total solution. But the fact of the matter is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We don't have a different result in this country. PET recycling is the same as it was 20 years ago. Despite all the great efforts, I'm not saying people aren't making great efforts. The ton has evolved tremendously, the volume of material, the way we conduct business, we get it all, okay? But there needs to be some sort of metric at some point in order to hold people accountable. And we view that in combination with some sort of pathway, if you will, to grow the marketplace. And we don't, you know, listen, as a general rule, regulation is an anathema to what we do. But if we need a little help accordingly, and I think you've seen a shift in industry. I think industry through organizations like the Recycling Partnership and others, you're seeing a recognition by industry, by that I mean the consumer brands, that policy needs to be a driver. Maybe not a hammer, but a pathway, so that we can support this ultimate goal of plastic packaging sustainability. Because we don't have a choice. It's either that or products are going to be banned. So I think, you know, we have to recognize what helps us get there. It's not a be-all and end-all, and so I'll leave it there.
And Pete?
Great. Well, on the voluntary side, Lynn, I think one of the most important things, that we're doing, and we challenge, others in the industry to do, is to commit to long-term supply contracts for PCR. Not buying PCR on the spot market, or not exiting PCR when the cost of, natural gas falls. As an organization, we've committed to purchasing PCR, including purchasing PCR at premiums, because we recognize the importance that long-term procurement contracts for PCR ultimately plays in not only, accelerating the reclaiming capacity in our nation, but also stimulating collection, which is absolutely necessary. Now, the way that policy plays into it, again, I don't like to recreate the wheel, so I look back in history and say, is there another policy intervention that is similar? And when we look at, the inflow of renewable energy in our nation, and it's a generational success, and why did that happen? Well, renewable portfolio standards played an incredible important role in accelerating and really pushing the adoption of that. And so, what's the counterpart to that in the packaging space? It's recycled content mandates. And I think recycled content mandates that are ambitious but ultimately attainable, I think, are that kind of, it prevents purchasers of PCR to exit the market when natural gas is really low. So I think they play hand in hand, but voluntarily, I think long-term supply contracts and a very real commitment, similar to what Steve said at the end of his presentation, making commitments, because our consumers, they want two things. They want convenience in packaging, but they want sustainability in packaging too. And I think the quicker that brands recognize that and adapt to it, the better we're all going to be for it.
Great, thank you. So California, others, Pete, Sarah, 30% post-consumer recycled content seems to be kind of an average number that gets thrown around a lot. I know, Pete, you have some goals that are 100%, California law would go to 50%, but 30% is kind of a number that gets thrown around a lot. Why? How do these numbers get picked? Do they relate to anything? Whoever wants to answer first.
Well, Lynn, let me go first.
Okay.
Lynn, I'll go. We were involved in the discussion last year, and what really is troubling to us is that these numbers are pulled out of thin air with no real understanding of what the supply chain can deliver. We did so when we were engaged in California last year, and they had some numbers, and we were very clear. At this point, all you're doing is picking numbers out of the air because it sounds good, and it's not based on anything. So we did some industry data and some industry review, and interesting, two other organizations, unbeknownst to us, were doing the same thing at the same time. We came up with the same concept. So right now, there's probably enough material, well, actually no longer in California. This was before the CRV implosion in California. There was probably enough material being collected so that you could reach probably a 24% recycled content rate for bottles by 2025. 24%, not 25%. And the other two groups agreed. But beyond that, it didn't matter what number you picked. If you didn't expand the collection of material, there was nothing available for you to meet any of those numbers. And what you ultimately were going to be doing is you're going to have an intra-industry fight between the fiber guys and the carpet guys and the sheet guys and the thermoform guys for the same material. So they're going to be cannibalizing each other. It wasn't going to be growing the market. So your numbers need to be based on hard data in terms of what is available. And we're a big advocate of slow growth on any requirement. prove to the industries that we can support that we can support the numbers that you're talking about. So this is a seminal change. Why are we trying to take a number and overnight have this large number? We're talking about a generational change. So let's start with 10%, and then in a few years, move the goalpost a little bit. If we've met 10%, let's do this systematically. So that's our big concern with how they pick these numbers.
Okay. Now, Sarah, of course, the U.S. Plastics Pact has very aggressive targets, not for this year, but in general. So how do Steve's remarks weigh into that?
Very strongly. So it's hard to follow that with such a thorough and great answer. And it plays directly into the consideration that went into the development of the Plastics Pact goals. Ultimately, it was a significant stakeholder engagement process, lots of consultation with Steve and many others over several months. And I would note that the aggressive targets around the recycling rate are directly tied to the targets around recycled content. Note that they're also dependent on the design of materials. So we did take this systematic view, and ultimately a significant stakeholder engagement with industry organizations, as well as those signatories of the U.S. Plastics Pact that led to those targets.
Great. Now, Pete, so Nestle Waters came out, well, feels like many years ago, could have been a couple of years ago, with your sustainability goals in terms of post-consumer recycled content, and you shared today about the 100% goal for one of your lines. So how did you come up with those numbers?
Yeah, so our own numbers are are based on our projections on what we believe ultimately is going to be achievable for us. And so there are pretty specific strategies to meet those numbers. But stepping back, Lynn, kind of more broadly for us, and this was a conversation with California AB 793, as well as some of the other recycled content bills that have been pending, whether it's Washington, New Jersey, or even Maine, that it doesn't make sense to us to set percentages based on static collection numbers of today, saying that the pie isn't going to increase, right? And so for us, there are some assumptions that the collection pie is going to increase, but also something that I know that Steve might be critical about, but also reorientating where some of our packaging is going. So for example, for us, it's great that our bottle might be recycled and put back into fiber or textile, but we see that as an organization as downcycling. So part of these recycled content goals, and again, I know that Steve's probably going to have a lot to say about this, but these recycled content goals, particularly on beverage containers, are meant to reorient those products, reorient those markets so that our beverage containers, when collected, go back into beverage containers. For us, that's what circularity means. So in some ways, when we're looking at that collection pie, even today, there's a lot of the PET beverage bottle that's being collected that's going into non-food grade applications. And that's something that we believe with beverage specific recycled content standards that we can bend even today's collection back into beverage containers. We also believe too that when you start putting a value on a material, it's treated differently. And when we move to think about these materials as important resources that brands need to meet regulatory obligations, those materials will have a value, and as a result, the incentive to collect continues to increase. And so the pie, when we look at what the collection pie is in 2030, when California's 50% recycled content standard is, we're expecting that pie to be a lot bigger.
Great. And so there have been several questions about the difficulty or credibility of obtaining enough PCR, and I think you've all now remarked on that. And the concept of, and I liked the term you used, the collection pie. I hadn't heard that term before, Pete. So since last year or so, when the China fence stuff really happened, and TERP was really one of the national leaders and drivers in this conversation, we've had so much focus on quality of what Lynn puts in her bin. And of course, it's very important. I mean, there is a direct relationship to the value of materials that go through a MRF based on the quality, on the cost of the MRF to make it clean, the comparison, as you noted, Pete, to the container deposit law sources. But my personal experience is that a lot of the states have, in this couple of year period, shifted their attention from increased collection to quality. And I don't know, perhaps you each have a different perspective. I'd be delighted to hear that. Feel comfortable telling me I'm wrong. But where does increased collection, how does that balance out against those critical needs of quality? So Sarah, I'll start with you since I pointed at you.
Sure. We think that they're both critically important and they can both be done at the same time. So there are plenty of households in the United States that still don't have equal access to recycling. That is a great place to start. We need everyone to have easy access to recycling, and that's a great time to start people off from recycling the right way. We also have proven tools though. We know even with established programs, when communities implement the tools and educate and inform people on how to recycle right, that it makes a big difference. And that's why we make those tools available free for communities. We provide that technical assistance because in our opinion, it's both. You have to have, we need more material, but it also has to be collected in a way that is follows the quality that's needed.
Great. And Pete, what's your insights in that to this comment?
You know, as a food manufacturer, quality is of utmost importance. I mean, you're talking about food contact materials. And so, you know, it's not an either or for us. You know, it's a both. I think one of the conversations that's happening at the federal level is minimum performance standards on material recycling facilities. I think though that is a really important conversation. Standardization, I know that APR has been a big component of that, as well as TRP. And so for us, you know, the answer is yes. You know, they both are absolutely critically important.
And
particularly
Steve?
if we want to, you know, realize circularity.
Steve, do you have thoughts you want to contribute to that?
Well, again, I harken back, Lynn, to the concept of it all starts with design. You know, for a recycler, we face talk about in the bale that we get, we face increased contamination rates that sometimes approach 30 to 35% in a bale. And that's where design is so incredibly important of the material. The other thing is there's some wish cycling going on out there, or some fraudulent labeling about something's recyclable and it's not recyclable, it might have a contaminant. There's some labeling programs out there that cause some confusion. And a lot of packaging innovation that is currently taking place is frankly non-recyclable or more contaminating to the stream. And it's replacing historically recyclable packaging. So for the recycler, contamination is an ever increasing hurdle and something we deal with every single day. And it leads to less material being able to ultimately be recycled and made available to the marketplace. So again, it's a part of a system-wide issue. And, you know, design is important. And obviously labeling is important for people like yourself to make sure you put the proper material in the proper bin. And so those are things that we need to continue to strive to work on.
Great. Could you maybe just amplify a little bit, please, Steve, please, on when you say the design of products, how does that relate to this topic?
Well, if you design a product, and you know, I'll use an example which by and large we've solved, but it's a good indicator of what happened. So when you take a PET bottle and you put a full wrap shrink label around it, and you put that in your bin. Well, unless it is the right type of label, or unless the recycler now has what is called a delabeler, that full wrap shrink label that you put on that bottle inhibits the ability of the NIR sortation to read the resin underneath that label, because historically you need about 20 to 25% of the bottle to show, so you can identify what that resin is. So the PET doesn't flow along with, say, your laundry detergent bottle. So that's an example of design. It could be, the label could have too much adhesive on it. It could be the wrong ink. It could be a barrier, a nylon type of barrier. It could have too much of filler in it or something on those. So those are all the types of things that can happen. It could have the wrong label component.
Okay.
We have on our website, there's a 5 for focus chart that essentially tells you, if you were to avoid these 5 things, you're going to avoid almost 90% of the contamination for a PET stream. And they're fairly simple. It's got to do with labels and inks and closures. So that's what I talk about when I talk about contamination.
Great, thank you. So where, if anywhere, do you think non-mechanical recycling technologies play into the opportunities for increased use of post-consumer recycled content? I don't know if you want to go first.
Let someone else go. You don't want my
I'm sorry?
answer.
Okay. Pete, well, with that, we're going to have to hear it. Pete or Sarah, do you want to comment first?
I can certainly comment in a general form. So I think from our perspective, non-mechanical, chemical, advanced, whatever you want to call it, is an innovation that we need to continue to watch. It is not mainstream today, and it is still a long way away from that. So we think innovation is an important part of the solution, but at the end of the day, we still have to figure out how to collect the material. We still have to collect the material. We have to get it out of people's homes. We have to get it in a way that is clean enough even for advanced recycling facilities to handle, and that's not always the case today, whether it is recovered at home or even sometimes at retail locations. So for us, that's where we're going to continue to focus, is how to get that material back while closely monitoring, working with the innovations for the future.
Great. And Pete, before we hear the dynamic Steve.
Yeah, that's right. Our position is very similar to that of Sarah's. I mean, so much of our focus right now is improving our mechanical recycling infrastructure, and we all know, there's a lot of work to be done there. And so that's where our focus is. I mean, as I kind of said at the beginning of my presentation, we are focused on material innovation, kind of figuring out what that could look like, but again, kind of right now, really looking how to optimize, our mechanical systems and making them not only, environmentally, productive, but also realizing the economics of a really good system as well, job creation and as we think about kind of green recovery out of, coming out of COVID.
Great. And Steve, tell us all.
Well, I think first of all, I agree with Sarah and Pete. It's by and large, chemical recycling has been around for a while, and the concept today, however, seems to have created this sort of irrational exuberance that, okay, chemical recycling is going to be the savior of all our problems with the plastics recycling infrastructure. And I think both Sarah and Pete pointed out that, if anything, to the extent that we're talking about chemical recycling today, it's in the embryonic stages. There is a lot of research to talk about. It's going to take a long time to get up to scale. The economics are out of whack. They just don't work at this point. It's been a lot of times you hear chemical recycling will take the traditionally non-recyclable plastics and go from there. But you know, the little bit of history we have show that that's not enough feedstock to support that industry. So I think the other thing, the concern that I have from a philosophical standpoint, is that you've got companies like Pete's and whatever that are really looking to enhance the recyclability of their products today, given the system we have. And you know, from our perspective, we think, you know, chemical recycling is part of plastics recycling. It's an adjunct to, it should be a component of and a complement to. The concern I have is that this exuberance around it as the ultimate savior, I don't want it to deprive technological innovation by both brands and the industry to continue to drive their packaging and design their packaging so they're compatible with recycling. I worry about the concept that, okay, well, we're not going to have to worry about any of the contaminants that I talked to you about just a couple of minutes ago, because we're just going to be able to put our stuff in the bin and chemical recycling is going to solve everything for us, and we're going to be able to say we use recycled content. I don't see that coming right away, and so that's a concern that I have as we go forward. It is plastics recycling if chemical recycling goes back to plastics. We don't consider plastics to fuel as recycling, so that's another component as we have. But at the end of the day, as Sarah said, we still have to collect the material, and we've got to get the supply up because our supply chain is woefully inadequate, and that's where we need to focus.
Okay, thank you. So great conversation and insights. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'm hoping that you might each briefly, just because of time, share your thoughts about, apart from a regulatory system, what are some drivers that could be used to encourage the use of recycled content, as well as buying things with recycled content? So, Pete, you want to start us, please?
Sure. You know, that's a good question, Lynn, and one that I probably would love some time to think about. But I think, you know, initially, I think one of the things that we can do as consumers is place a value on products that are manufactured with recycled content. You know, as we talked about today, you know, brand owners who make that commitment to move to recycled content, you know, are often paying premiums, you know, compared to maybe competing products that, you know, are using, you know, virgin materials. And as a result, I mean, I think it's all incumbent upon us to, you know, as consumers, you know, as we interact with consumers, to really place, you know, a value on products and packaging that are produced sustainably.
Okay, great. And Sarah?
I would note that we think it's very important that everyone is part of the solution. We need to be thinking holistically across the system. How do we use less, recycle more, and maximize recycled content? And we see one of the ways to do that is what we like to call, our CEO, Keith Harrison, puts it well, that we insist and we assist. So through efforts like the Pact, we have to insist and hold people accountable for doing the right thing and for using the content and sticking to their goals. And we have to help them get there. We have to give them a mechanism that they can support and invest in to improve the infrastructure in the United States.
Great. And Steve, except for Lynn, you get the last word. Because I get the last word.
Well, great. Well, again, get back to what I said earlier. We think that the use of recycled content is the key driver in the market demand. I mean, and Pete, you know, Pete talks about price. Well, the fact of the matter is, I think his company is one of the few that have identified a solution. If a brand company is willing to enter into a long-term contract to purchase material from a recycler, then you can get close to price parity. The spot market month-to-month stuff, you know, is just not a sustainable economic model. So if, you know, any business wants some certainty in the supply chain and then demand chain. And so we think that certainly can go a long way toward addressing that issue. And but again, we think that market demand will drive a lot of the solutions.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. 3 outstanding speakers. Sarah Dearman from TRP, Pete de Pasquale from Nestle Waters, Steve Alexander, APR Thank you so phenomenally much, and to our audience who had really sensational questions that I didn't ask you because there were just so many of them. But thank you for your attention and your contributions. I do want to, I noted that we have a container deposit laws taking their effectiveness, the next global level webinar on the 28th. We also have a webinar about buying recycled on November 5th, recycled content and paper on December 2nd, plastics, a complex topic, a global perspective on December 8th, and a buying recycled training on January 13th. So links to all of these are on NERC's homepage. All the webinars are free thanks to our generous sponsors. The recording and PowerPoint presentations will be on NERC's homepage tomorrow, and you will receive an email about it. So again, with that, so much gratitude to all of our wonderful speakers and our audience, and have a fabulous rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lynn. You're the
You're
best.
welcome. Bye-bye.